Very, very warm welcome to everybody to this symposium on student engagement and partnership. It won't have escaped your notice that this is a 50-year anniversary of Robbins, and it's also a 50-year anniversary of the University of Lancaster, along with other so-called plate glass universities. So, prompted by this sort of coincidence, we thought it would be interesting to focus on student engagement 50 years on, as it were. Now, my job at this moment is just to give a bit of housekeeping news. Well, news is hardly the word for it. But there shouldn't be a fire alarm this morning. So if there is one, it is really happening. Now, to get out of here, you just go into the foyer and turn left, and you're out on this spine. It's as easy as that. So if you do hear anything, then that's where you need to go. All refreshments will be in the foyer area. That will be at lunchtime at 12:30, and also again at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Those 2 moments will be in the foyer. There will be a reception to which you are cordially invited after our final plenary session around about 4 o'clock. And that's up in the Department of Education Research, and we'll just walk over there together. There'll also be some entertainment from the world-class Howard Haig, who is a guitarist. Let me introduce myself. My name is Murray Saunders. I'm the co-director of the Centre for Higher Education Research and Evaluation here in the Department of Education Research. And I'm one of the organising team. Another person is Paul Trowler over here, who is also a co-director of the centre. Caroline Tutton-Wood is also part of the team, and she'll say a little bit about herself in a moment or two. And Catherine, luckily we've caught her, because normally she ducks behind a pillar if she's pointed out, is also part of the team. So I think I've run through those housekeeping issues, so I'd like to hand over to Caroline just to say a little bit more about the framework for the symposium and also a little bit about herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Caroline Tutton-Wood, and I'm a traditional route PhD student here at the university, and I'm in the Department for Educational Research. I'm studying engaging non-traditional students for retention and success within higher education. And I've been part of the staff student events team, and we've been working on organising this event for months, so we hope you enjoy it. It seems very fitting that we take this opportunity to reflect on how the student experience is different now to how it was portrayed when we look back 50 years at the Robbins report. Students attending university were clearly mentioned a great deal, but were represented in a passive role within a changing environment. The student position has now shifted quite considerably in the last 50 years, and the emerging centrality of student engagement is clear, and it's where we begin today's event. I would now like to welcome Professor Paul Trowler, who's going to start today's symposium and talk to us about the concept of student engagement.
Thanks, Caroline, and welcome everybody. It's really good to see so many people, some familiar faces, some new faces. I hope we get a chance to talk to all of you during the day. And like you, I'm sure I'm looking forward to the wine later on. Oh, typical, yes. So the shortest keynote in the world from me, and then an equally short one from Bill Harvey, who we're very pleased to have here from the QAA in Scotland, illuminating the concept of student engagement. And what I wanted to do basically was to set out a framework on which the structure of the day is based to some extent of what we mean, or what we think we mean, or what we can mean by student engagement. This comes from 2 projects. One was funded by the Higher Education Academy, 2010, and then a subsequent one funded by the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education, 2010-2011. And I worked with Vicky Trowler. You can always tell the Trowlers in this room because they've got white jackets on, so that's very simple. And actually, Vicky did all the work, so I'm a complete fraud this morning, and I'm a complete fraud in the workshop because I'm working with Phil, who did his doctorate on student engagement, so they both know much more about it than I do. But I think it's really important to define concepts. And as Caroline said, the approach to student engagement and student partnership is quite different from that taken by Robbins. All of this stuff is available in the several outputs from the two projects, and there's a YouTube video of me giving a much longer keynote. There we go. About this, if you want more than 15 minutes, you probably won't. So basically, we've got three foci of student engagement, three areas in the literature. Vicky wrote a 20,000-word literature review of everything that could be found, calling itself about student engagement. So the three foci then, the big one in the literature is individual student learning. What goes on in the classroom, student-centered learning, if you like, even to the extent of negotiating the syllabus and the methods of teaching, etc. Second one we call structure and process, part of which is representation, involvement in the actual management in some way, or at least giving student voice in terms of feedback, etc. But we wanted to broaden it in the work for the HEA and the Leadership Foundation to engagement in some sense in structure and process. And then the third area of the literature that the concept of student engagement embraces is the question of identity change, a sense of community, a change in the identity in terms of who you think you are, and a feeling of involvement or not with the institution or perhaps the college that you're in. I think here at Lancaster, being a collegiate as well as a collegial university, we're quite lucky. Students here identify very quickly with the college. You know, I've heard drunk students singing "Boland or Dead" 2 weeks after starting here. So Boland is one of the colleges. Great, quickly getting that identification. And then you can divide those three areas. You can see the three areas in the red there: learning, identity, structure, and process, along various axes. From really no involvement, no engagement, to full participation, in terms of identity, being completely alienated, not feeling involved at all, and not having any identity change, right through to total inclusivity and really significant identity change. And then in terms of learning, no interest, no involvement, to fully student-centered in the sense really of students being involved in planning the curriculum, in assessment, and so on. So, and that's really what we're talking about when we compare back to Robbins 51 years ago. Quite low down, early on in the spectrum on each of those. It's worth mentioning Paul Ashwin's head of department, his work with colleagues, ESRC-funded research into quality and inequality in sociology, pedagogic equality. What they found was that engagement with knowledge had important implications, important effects on identity, on feelings of involvement, and so on. And really the point I'm making here is that research into sociology in three different institutions, sociology students in three quite contrasting institutions, showed that we shouldn't really divide the concept of student engagement up into those three parts. It's conceptually useful, it's academically useful, it has heuristic power, but if we do so, we can miss the fact that they affect each other. So that research, I think, was really quite useful in demonstrating that, the engagement with academic knowledge, which is, of course, part of the teaching and learning axis. Then, just to further complexify slightly the situation, we can talk about, along each of those three axes, behavioral, emotional, and cognitive engagement. What you do, how you feel, and how you think, and what you're thinking about. And then you can have congruent or oppositional engagement, So congruent engagement is really doing what you're expected to do, what you're being asked to do in terms of studying these texts, doing these exams well, and so on. But you also get the other form of engagement, oppositional engagement, sometimes called negative engagement in the literature, but I don't think that's quite right, where there's rebellion and innovation, change and so on. And I often like to think of the example of the NUS protesting against the introduction of fees, captured by the media at the time because somebody perhaps threw or maybe dropped a fire extinguisher from a roof, and then that became the story. But that was engagement. Those students were engaged, but it was oppositional in a sense to, in that case, the policy of the introduction of fees at the time. And I think most people would agree that higher education, in a sense, is about that. We don't want them to be sheep who just do what we tell them to do. We want them to become free thinkers, critical thinkers, thinking for themselves. And so oppositional isn't negative, as it's sometimes described in the literature. It's oppositional, it's thinking differently, and that's what we want. So you can see in the boxes there, in the matrix, the different things that you might see. What we don't want, of course, is non-engagement, the thing in the middle. So Vicky and I tried to come up with a definition of engagement. Always a good idea to try to define your terms, but this is a working definition, and I don't think either of us like it very much, really, but it's about as close as we can come. So the investment of time, effort, and other relevant resources by both students and their institutions intended to optimize the student experience and enhance the learning outcomes and development of students, and the performance and reputation of the institution. I'll come back to that little difference in a minute between the learning outcomes and development of students and performance and reputation of the institution. The trouble is that could apply to most things, I think. It could be to do with getting more computers and stuff. So it's not quite specific enough. And the other trouble with it is, actually, Michael Apple said, concepts have wings, they fly. And they do. Then concepts are not stable, and student engagement it has very big wings, and it flies a long way. It's used for different purposes. So it's a really tough ask to try to define it. The QAA helpfully have had a go. So they've got this little 2-minute video. Had a go at defining it. The video is called What is Student Engagement? So let's have a look at them. Phil and I will be thinking a bit more about this in our workshop.
What is student engagement? Student engagement is about you getting involved, raising your views, feeling empowered, and shaping your education. QAA work with student representatives and the National Union of Students to help us see your perspective. Since quality matters, we hold events to bring together students and university staff. That way, you get to influence decision makers and share your good practice. QAA also have a student advisory board which allows students to give us their views and act as our critical friend. We even have students on our board of directors. When we carry out reviews at your university or college, we use student reviewers on our teams to ensure students are at the centre of the process. You can even get involved in a review by becoming or supporting the lead student representative. They provide QAA with useful information on what students think about their educational experience. They look at student opinion, results from surveys, and other feedback. Getting involved means you can have confidence in your education, making sure you have the best possible student experience while studying. Find out more at qaa.ac.uk/partners/students or follow us on Twitter at QAA Tweets.
I should have brought my guitar, shouldn't I? Played along. Okay, there we go. Oh, it's going to go on forever. Right, little background. So you can see, there we go, it's that one, isn't it? Yeah. That, understandably, it's their job, the QAA are concentrating on the structure, and what we call the structure and process axis of, or focus of student engagement. And you might like to think where that is on the spectrum, the little boxes, the cube with the little boxes in. Contrast that, as Phil and I will be, with the NUS manifesto, Student Partnership Manifesto. Quite an interesting contrast to be made there. And I'll come on to implementation issues in a second. So going back to that definition, and right at the end, for the development of the student and the reputation, etc., of the institution. Question is engagement for what? And you can see, and the gap is significant there, and that's the gap between really issues around the student and the effects on the student and so on, and the interests of the institution. And that's what I mean about concepts have wings and how people use it and so on. The purposes that it's being deployed for are really important in affecting what people actually mean by it. So I think you can also see the influence of educational ideology behind this. And I think there's something of a battle going on at the moment between people who think that student engagement is really significant and want to see, for example, the National Student Survey being replaced by the National Student Engagement Survey, such as the ones that they have in America and Australia, and ones coming in other countries as well. And of course, Alex Buckley, who's with us at the moment from the HEA, is responsible for piloting a student engagement survey. So we've got the market model of student engagement founded in what I would call an enterprise ideology, which sees higher education in particular ways, and its job as being to do with the economy. Okay. And then a developmental model, which is rooted in what I would call progressivism, which I think you can see in Robbins, you can certainly see it in Deering, and so on. So the battle between students as consumers and students as fully engaged partners in what they do. So here's an example of marketing, using engagement in marketing, students using clickers to cast a view or make a choice on what the lecturer is saying. And I'm having to go very quickly here. And thinking about these different alternatives, where one stands in on the axes, the spectrums for each of those three foci. It's really important, I think, to think about where are we now, where, my institution, if I'm trying to enhance engagement, what is salient for us, which of those three dimensions, what is congruent with what we do already. To have a revolution, at least in a higher education context, doesn't happen much, and what's profitable. How can we, in a sense, sell it to those involved? And the final slide has some of the resources that are available that I've mentioned. And it's time for me to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. The purpose of these two keynotes really is to set the scene a little, to problematize the concept of student engagement and provide some resources really for our work within the workshops. The second of our keynotes is by Bill Harvey. Now, many of you may know of Bill. For us at Lancaster, we've had a very interesting and fruitful relationship with Bill over the last 10 or 12 years as we provided evaluative support to the quality enhancement framework within the Scottish environment. Now, Bill's had quite an interesting track record or background. I hope you won't mind me saying this, but he was interested, and he did his PhD on the sociology of science. But his second supervisor was, as he puts it, Peter Higgs, who subsequently did rather well. So I'm just grateful that he actually didn't stick with the academic sociology of science, but moved to the Scottish Funding Council in the mid-90s. Now, in a way, it was there that he made a particularly significant contribution because, I hope you won't mind me saying this, but and in some ways, this is not typical of the Scottish environment, but he was a true visionary as far as student engagement, the student experience was concerned, and took seriously, moved away from rhetoric, and took seriously the idea of putting into place, along with partners throughout the whole sector, ways of understanding the student experience, which were really quite different. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome you, Bill, and you'll be drawing on your experience and helping us to think through the day. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Murray. I should stress, in case it's not obvious, I no longer work for QAA. I retired 6 weeks ago, and I can now speak freely and uninhibitably and unencumbered by evidence, I have to say as well. You're going to see some similarities of topic between what I'm talking about and what Paul was doing, because some of the issues around what do we mean by engagement are the same wherever you go. But the focus I'm going to give, I hope, is, I guess, the distillation of my experience over more years than I care to think about. First of all, as an academic, and then as a bureaucrat with the Funding Council, and then what's beyond a bureaucrat, working for QAA in any case. And I want to in part talk about notions about what do we mean by engagement, and who's it engagement for, and who's it by, and who's it through, and then think about some of the challenges that we've had to think about in Scotland as we've worked through our systems, and I think they're still there, and they're bigger probably today than they ever were before. So, first of all, some potted history. Again, this is way back in the last century, so I mean, some of you weren't even born when all this happened, but I guess the thing to bear in mind is the 1992 Act, which set up the funding councils, and that set up separate funding and administrative and quality assurance arrangements in all the UK countries. Well, England, Wales and Scotland anyway. And I guess the interesting thing there is the Act gave to the Funding Council for the first time the statutory responsibility to secure the assessment of the quality of provision. That doesn't necessarily mean do it themselves, but need to make sure it's being done. That's the first time quality appears in UK higher education legislation. And indeed, there are big issues about what do we mean by quality, what do we mean by standards, but effectively that set up the subject review process, the TQA process that some of you may remember, and different ones in the different parts of the UK. I got involved halfway through that subject series, first of all as a physics reviewer, and then working for the Funding Council to support the rest of them. And then we began to talk about what might follow beyond that. QAA was set up, Scotland stayed out originally, but we agreed, let's go forward in a state of common purpose across the UK. There's some interesting themes here which are contemporarily relevant as well. And the interesting thing happened between about 2000 and 2002, a classic part of Scottish traditional history, English treachery. I suppose I should say that by English, I really mean London. I mean, Bonnie Queen's Charlie got as far south as Derby, so everything down to there is sort of semi-Scottish. But in London, we agreed, let's set up a UK-wide framework for standards and quality assessment that will run for the next 6 years. We'd finished our cycle slightly earlier than England. We said, OK, we'll go first, but you will come and join us, won't you? We will stick with us for 6 years. Oh, yes. And we said, it's not going to be like the poll taxes, that you tried it in Scotland, you think it didn't work, but you didn't pay any attention until the English didn't like it. Oh, no. Well, indeed, that's exactly what happened. We did 2 years of subject-based review for a second cycle, and then David Blunkett got nobbled by Oxbridge, saying, burden of review, don't do this. And it all fell apart. And the good thing that follows from that was finally, I think, people in Scotland thought, bugger this, we'll do something for ourselves and try and think through. And indeed, the interesting thing was the sector came along with that, because up till then, University Scotland had been rather nervous about breaking away in any significant way from Universities UK on all sorts of things. They were nervous about devolution, and they're equally nervous about independence, but we'll maybe come to that later. Anyway, the result was the quality enhancement framework that Murray was then subsequently contracted to evaluate. And the striking thing that is, it's still in force. That was 2003. How many educational innovations in higher education have lasted more than 10 years? It's amazing, really, that it's actually happened. Now, it has evolved, it's tweaked, it's changed in various ways, but the basic premise The basic principles are still there, and they're actually quite important ones, I think. They're based on fundamental issues about trust. The system is a trusted institution system. We don't have to run around looking for problems all over the place. Institutions, broadly speaking, are allowed to, are expected to, and acknowledge that they do look after the quality of the provision and the welfare of their students. The role of the national systems that come in beyond that are simply to audit that process with a fairly light touch model. And that I think, has informed everything that's gone on in Scotland since then. And it's a great thing to hang on to and not to lose sight of. Another part, I won't go into all the detail, another big part of that was the student voice. And we talked about amplifying the student voice. And that raises all sorts of questions what that means. But one of the concrete things that went there was, from 2003, we had student reviewers always in institutional reviews in Scotland. England caught up 2010, was it, something like that? And even then, that was interesting, because there were some institutions were given the choice. We'd like to introduce student reviewers, said QAA, but because it's mid-cycle, we're not going to enforce it. And something like 25% said no. And we couldn't get our heads around this, and I still can't get my head around it. What was the problem? And it's something about its students, you know, they're going to be disruptive, they're going to be strange in some way. It just happened in Scotland, and for all sorts of political reasons, I think, because NUS was quite powerful. It was a Labour-led coalition in Scotland. NUS had the ear of the minister. If we had NUS on board, that was really helpful in terms of moving things forward. And we ended up funding and setting up a body called SPARKS, Student Participation in Quality Scotland. It's a sort of acronym. Which was designed to support student representatives, initially by actually training individual reps. That became quite unscalable when you moved into not only universities, but the college sector in Scotland, and now provides capacity for institutions to train and support student reps, and student associations to train their own reps. So there's a kind of central expertise and source of advice and guidance and lobbying and so on, which has been there. And in England, again, they've caught up finally with this over the last year or two. I'm not quite sure it's got the same tone, but that's a different question for a different place. So in a sense, I think you could argue we've had this sorted, haven't we, since 2003. And I think that sometimes we ride on that a bit and sort of sail around the world saying, yeah, Scotland's student representation, student engagement, in with the bricks. And to be fair, Sparks has had a lot of interest shown to it from countries like South Africa, Australasia, Wales, not England, not really to the same extent. And I think there is a lot to be said for this. Now, whether it's workable in other countries, I think, is a big question, and that may be something to reflect on as part of today. So we've faced the issues about where student engagement takes place, and obviously I've been looking at the concept of quality assurance, reviews, things like complaints, things like student staff liaison committees, boards of studies, councils or governing bodies and so on. Those are all written into the procedures, part of the QAA code, and indeed some additional code that applies in Scotland. And I think that's fine, and operationally that's going on, but I've been left now, and I say, because I'm in a position now to maybe step back a bit and think about it differently, it does leave us with certain issues. And I'll simply start thinking about how these things work. What do we mean by engagement in this context? I mean, there's a danger that you get into happy sheets. Satisfaction surveys are big drivers, and it's a big driver for management and institutions. That number gets published. That number, if it goes down, has negative consequences. And so that has taken, in a sense, some of the steam out of this idea of engagement as partners and talked about keep them happy, get that number up. Big issue, of course, certainly in Scotland, I think, or throughout the UK, has been assessment on feedback, where these numbers are stubbornly refused to go the way everybody wants them to go. And it becomes almost a kind of, how can we get it into students' head that the assessment, the feedback they're getting is really good? Because it isn't perceived that way. And there are genuine issues. I mean, the worst university in Scotland is Edinburgh. And yet, in every other grade that you think about, in research and international reputation, Edinburgh is the best university in Scotland. And there are also ways you can carve it up. What does that mean? Does that mean that Edinburgh students are getting the crappiest assessment process in Scotland? Or is it they got higher expectations? Or there's some mismatch between what they might get and what they might not get? Those things are flying around, and I think there's a danger that if that number doesn't start to go in the right direction, it might start to be the tail that wags the dog in all sorts of different ways. But what's underlying that, I suppose, is what's the nature of engagement? Because satisfaction surveys are based on some notion of a sort of consumerist model of I'm buying some sort of education, I'm entitled to some sort of service, give it to me, I'll know when I've got it, I'll know whether what I got is good enough, and I can make an expression of that. That's one model, that's a kind of purchasing model, which I think is increasingly pushed on us, in England at least, by the size of the fees, which are now getting ridiculous. In Scotland, there isn't the same emphasis on the cash amount of fee, but there's still a huge investment of time, effort and opportunity cost of going to university, and a huge emphasis on what's it going to deliver in terms of a return, an instrumentalist approach to this. And many of us, certainly in my generation, were brought up with a quite different culture, either a sort of public-spirited public sector model where the students were the clients and the professionals took on board the interests of the clients as sort of part of their professional development and professional identity. And we found appeals to professionalism are a far better and more productive way to get around than appeals to the QAA will be in next week to check things out. Or you end up with transformational models where you say, look, education is a transformational process. Students are co-creators of their learning. We use all these words, and these words are written in documents that were involved in policy reviews in Scotland. I'm not sure we really ever deliver on them, though. It's a big ask to expect a student to come in and co-create their learning. I mean, it's a stereotype, but I mean, I did actually teach students who would say things like, my bus is at 5 o'clock. I have to leave at 5 o'clock. I'm not going to stay for your committee. Tell me what I need to do to get through this exam. And who's to say they're wrong? That's a reasonable, valid thing for some students to do. There's the old joke about transformational learning about how many counsellors it would take to change a light bulb, and the answer is 1, but the light bulb has to want to change. And I think there's this kind of model in our heads that students have to do this. They have to come along and be involved in things, and whether it's sitting in committees or it's sitting in seminars and planning processes for new curricula. And many students either feel inhibited by this, or they're too busy. They've got other things in their lives. They've got childcare, they've got part-time work, all sorts of stuff going on. You certainly pick up, if you like, the middle classes, the assertive, articulate people who turn up and do these things. Many voices, when we talk about amplifying the student voice, are not heard in those processes, let alone the students who are not physically on campus and how you engage with, in some cases, thousands of those. So I think we have to be very careful when we're talking about engagement, that we just don't say breezily, we have all these mechanisms, we have all these committees, therefore we're engaging. Because we're maybe not engaging anything like the majority of all students all the time. And in many ways, what we're engaging with may not be what they really want to engage about. And I think we have to be careful that we don't just, as it were, metaphorically pat ourselves in the head and say, sorted. And it's a tendency in Scotland, I think, sometimes to say, well, if we're doing it slightly better than England, that's a good start. Well, that isn't going to be a good enough start for the future. And I think we have to think through how that might actually work. There is issues about new forms of higher education coming along, whether it's MOOCs, whether it's private providers, whether it's people just doing it in different sorts of ways, where the nature of the relationship is going to change. I think there'll be issues about lifelong learning, where instead of saying our job is, in a sense, a kind of taking adolescents and turning them into adults. And some of what happens in university would have happened chronologically and biologically between the ages of 18 and 22 anyway, even if we did very little. That's not going to work the same way if you've got people in their 40s coming back for second and third shots. So I think, in a way, there's all sorts of advantages in talking about engagement as a model in our rhetoric, but really only to pose questions rather than actually give us some answers. And my sense in Scotland, and I'm going to stop, is it has worked. It has delivered useful things, and it does rely on strength, and it's therefore fragile to political change, and a model maybe to learn from. But let's not think we've cracked it. Let's think there's much more still to be done. Thanks.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Smith, Vice-Chancellor of Lancaster University, who's going to introduce this afternoon's events.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And it's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation to come and say a few words. I'll do the kind of formal welcome, although it seems slightly odd halfway through the day, but nevertheless I will do that. So for those of you who are not Lancaster people, very much welcome. I don't mean I don't welcome the Lancaster people, but they're used to turning up every day as well. But I'm sure from what I've heard this morning that there's been some lively sessions, and I'm very pleased that Educational Research, in partnership with the staff, in partnership with Caroline, have organised this event. Because I think the topic, enabling student engagement and partnership, is one that's absolutely crucial to the sector at the moment. So to have a discussion here on this very topic, I think is fantastic. And particularly as it's part of the overall programme that we're putting together to celebrate the 50th year of Lancaster University. Of course, one of the things is when people ask, well, when is it 50 years old? The fact is we don't know. We've got a rough idea, but of course it depends when you define a university as coming into existence. When was it? Was it when the bill was laid before Parliament? Was it when the Royal Charter was signed? Or was it actually when students turned up I would contend that it's not much of a university if it doesn't have any students. So therefore, we can define a whole series of dates extending over a period of well into 15 months, which means we can have a whole series of parties, but why not? But one of the things we are doing is we're badging several of the events of contributions like this as part of that 50th. And I think it's very important to recognise the 50th is an ongoing thing. It's a signal for the next steps, and that means the research goes on, the development of the university goes on, and events like this, I think, are clear signals of that. In terms of student engagement, if you sit in a kind of senior management role at the university, I think this is one of the key elements that we're grappling with, in the sense of you have these measures around the sector, like the student satisfaction that comes out of the the NSS, and I think it has a place. There's no doubt about that, and I think that place is quite important. However, and it's a bit of a danger when you're speaking to experts in the room, I think it's absolutely clear that a more important thing for us to understand is not what is the level of satisfaction, but what is the level of engagement. Because I think engagement is an indication of, well, in fact, I hope coming out of this you'll tell me, but nevertheless, I think it's a broader concept. And in fact, one of the things that was interesting talking to some of you over lunch is, how far does engagement extend? You've obviously got the development of the curriculum, you've got the role in the governance, but then you've got the role in the wider university, the volunteering activities, etc., etc., etc. And therefore, I think trying to define this, and I'll now say something fairly crude to kind of well-honed academics, to be able to measure what that actually is, because what really matters is the engagement good, and how do you define good, and how do you define what is better at one university than another. So I look forward to kind of some of the, I guess they're medium-term conclusions that will come out of the discussions that you're having today. The fact that I think there's kind of broad engagement and participation already is indicated by the fact that there's partnership here, not only from fellow universities, but also from the NUS and our own student union, which I think is a great indication, but also from QAA and other bodies. For example, I think what comes out of this debate actually will have an important resonance with, for example, bodies like the funding councils as well, because the funding councils, are there increasingly no longer as guardians of the public money, but guardians of the student experience and the students more generally. How are they going to determine whether we're doing that correctly or not? And so therefore, I think they should have an interest in this area as well. Now, I could look at some examples of partnership with the unit here at Lancaster, and also kind of reflect back. Although I like to still think of myself as relatively young, although I realise that middle age kind of creeps up on you very rapidly. You look in the mirror one day and you realise you're no longer young. However, when I think back to when I was a student, I just think, what sort of engagement did I have with the university? And I think the idea of a kind of staff-student liaison committee was highly novel. Now, of course, we've gone well beyond that now. And what types of ways are we expecting students to contribute now? I think we are definitely seeing it more as partnership. I don't want to overemphasise that because it would be overclaiming, I think. But I think there is more of a genuine belief that we're in this together, to coin a slightly hackneyed phrase. But nevertheless, to give you some examples of how I believe that, I mean, most universities have student representation on both their governing body and their senates, or their equivalents of senates. We do here, obviously, at Lancaster, and we have for obviously a very long time. But I think the level of that representation can be very variable. For example, I was quite surprised when I came to Lancaster 2.5 years ago by just how many students we do have on our Senate body, for example. It is a significant voting fraction of the Senate. So I think that's an indication that Lancaster for some time has believed in that contribution. And then one of the changes that I made when I came to Lancaster just under 2.5 years ago was, like most universities, we have a senior executive body. It's called UMAG, University Management Group. And I suggested, not without some resistance from some of my senior colleagues, that the student president should become a member of that. There was much more, this will stifle discussion, we can't let the students... It's had no effect on the level of discussion at all. And in fact, the reason I did it has been borne out by the fact that on several occasions, particularly when we're talking about core student-related matters, the intervention of the student president on our management group has stopped us doing stupid things. Now, it doesn't say we don't do stupid things on occasions, but nevertheless, we'd have done more of them if that voice had not been there. So my serious point there is, one cannot underestimate the contribution they can make, and the ideas that are now coming forward about co-creation of curricula, I think are very important. So I'm sure those topics will be kind of expanded upon. And a second example, I couldn't let an event like this go past without mentioning what I think is one of the key examples of kind of partnership between the university and the students here. Is we have this, for those of you that are not Lancaster people, you won't probably know much about this event, which is each year we have this thing called Roses. Now, Roses is it's a huge event. 120 sporting events or so take place over the bank holiday weekend in May, and this has happened for 50 years. And of course, as the title suggests, this has been a competition between York and Lancaster. When I first came here, someone told me, you've got to remember about Rose Week. And I said, don't you people realise this finished 600 or so years ago? But no, I mean, obviously it's a huge event. But the point is, Student Union definitely drive it and lead it. But I hope they agree that the university plays its role in making sure that that event is successful. And it is a great sporting event. So I think there are a whole, and of course Lancaster won this year, by the way. I should have said that. However, I think there are a whole range of events, a whole range of activities, at the university that demonstrates the importance of this. We still keep having to keep our thinking being renewed in this area, and it's through conferences like this and contributions from people in this audience that will challenge and keep our thinking fresh across the sector, but particularly here at Lancaster. So I wish you every success with the rest of your discussions, and I look forward very much to hearing what the outcomes of your deliberations are. So thank you very much.